They threw me out like trash the moment my husband's body was cold. I spent that first night shivering in my car, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled like him, watching the lights go out in what used to be my home. His children had moved. Too fast. They changed the locks within hours. They smiled at the funeral. They hugged me. They called me family. 1 week later, I was homeless. I'm 61 years old. I married Richard when I was 58. People said I was lucky. A second chance at love. A kind man with a beautiful home and a secure future. What they didn't tell me was that his children saw me as an intruder from day one. They were polite to my face. They called me by my first name, never Mom, which was fine. But behind those polite smiles was a plan. And the moment Richard died suddenly of a heart attack, that plan went into motion. I had no money. Richard handled everything. I trusted him. I trusted them. Big mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. Or so I thought. Because what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Richard had been smarter than all of us. He had a friend, an accountant. A man I barely remembered meeting at a dinner party 2 years ago. And in my darkest moment, sitting in that freezing car at 3 a.m., his name came back to me like a lifeline. What happened next changed everything. What I discovered made his children go pale. What I did was completely legal. Completely justified. And absolutely brilliant. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you exactly how greed destroys families. And how one woman found justice when she had nothing left to lose. ***, I met Richard at a community art class. I know it sounds like something from a romance novel, but that's exactly how it happened. I was 3 years into my divorce, finally starting to feel like myself again after 30 years of a loveless marriage. My ex had left me with almost nothing. The house went to pay his debts. My retirement was gone. I was working part-time at a library and living in a small apartment that smelled like mildew no matter how much I cleaned. Richard was different. He was kind, patient. He actually listened when I talked. He was 67, recently widowed, and learning to paint as a way to cope with loneliness. We started having coffee after class, then dinners, then weekend drives along the coast. For the first time in decades, I felt seen. I felt valued. I felt loved. 6 months later, he proposed. It wasn't some grand gesture. We were sitting on his back porch watching the sunset, and he just turned to me and said, "Margaret, I don't want to spend whatever time I have left without you." I cried. I said yes. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. His children were supportive at first, or at least they pretended to be. Richard had 2 kids from his first marriage. Daniel was 42, a real estate agent with an expensive car and a wife who wore too much perfume. Stephanie was 39, divorced twice, always complaining about money even though she lived in a house twice the size of my old apartment. They came to the wedding. They smiled in the photos. Stephanie even helped me pick out my dress, but I noticed little things. The way Daniel would talk to his father about finances when I wasn't in the room. The way Stephanie would go quiet whenever Richard mentioned updating his will. The way they both insisted on keeping their mother's photos all over the house. In every room, including the bedroom Richard and I now shared. When I gently suggested moving some to an album, Stephanie looked at me like I'd slapped her. Richard waved it off. He said they were still adjusting. He said give them time. He said they'd come around. I believed him. I loved him. I ignored the warning signs because I wanted so badly for this to work. I wanted to believe in second chances. I wanted to believe in happy endings. We had 3 beautiful years together. Richard retired fully. We traveled a little, nothing extravagant, just small road trips and quiet weekends at bed and breakfasts. We gardened together. We cooked together. We laughed more than I'd laughed in my entire first marriage. He told me constantly that marrying me was the best decision he'd ever made. He called me his miracle. But he never talked much about money. He handled all the bills, all the accounts, all the investments. He said he didn't want me to worry. He said he had everything taken care of. He said his kids would be fine, and so would I. I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband. My partner. The love of my second chance at life. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. I realize how vulnerable I made myself. But you don't think about these things when you're in love. You don't plan for betrayal when you're busy being happy. You don't imagine that the people smiling at your wedding are already calculating how to destroy you. Would you have seen it coming? Drop a comment below and tell me, because I sure didn't. Asterisk asterisk, it happened on a Tuesday morning. One of those perfect spring mornings where the sun is gentle and the air smells like fresh cut grass. Richard and I had just finished breakfast. He was reading the newspaper, something he still insisted on doing the old-fashioned way, and I was washing dishes. We were talking about maybe driving up the coast that weekend. He wanted to show me a little town he'd visited as a child. Then, he made a sound. Not a shout, not a scream, just this small grunt like he'd been surprised by something. I turned around and he was clutching his chest. His face had gone gray. The newspaper slid from his hands onto the floor. I ran to him. I called 911. I tried to remember the CPR training I'd taken years ago at the library. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. The operator kept telling me to stay calm, kept walking me through compressions, but I knew. Somehow I already knew. Richard's eyes were open, but he wasn't seeing me anymore. He wasn't seeing anything. The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes. It felt like 8 hours. They worked on him in the living room, then in the ambulance, then at the hospital. I sat in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and fear, praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. A doctor came out 2 hours later. His face told me everything before his words did. Richard was gone. Massive heart attack. They'd done everything they could. I'm so sorry for your loss. I don't remember much about the next few hours. I know I called Daniel first. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice casual, probably expecting his dad to be inviting him to dinner. When I told him, there was this long silence. Then he said he'd call his sister. He said he'd handle everything. He said I should just go home and rest. His voice was calm. Too calm. But I was in shock. I didn't notice. Stephanie arrived at the hospital within the hour. She hugged me. She cried. She said we'd get through this together. She said her dad loved me so much. She said she was glad he'd had me in his final years. I believed every word. I held on to her like she was family. Because I thought she was. The funeral happened 3 days later. Daniel arranged everything. The service, the flowers, the burial plot next to their mother. That should have bothered me, being buried next to his first wife, but I was too numb to care. I just wanted to honor Richard. I wanted to say goodbye. I wanted to believe that the man I loved had left this world knowing how much I cherished him. The funeral was beautiful. Over 100 people came. Richard had been well-liked, involved in the community, generous with his time and money. People told me stories I'd never heard. They said such kind things. Daniel and Stephanie stood on either side of me at the graveside. They each held one of my hands. Stephanie whispered that I was part of their family now. That they'd take care of me just like their dad would have wanted. I cried. I believed her. I thought grief had brought us together. I thought tragedy had turned us into a real family. I had no idea that the real tragedy was just beginning. I had no idea that in exactly 7 days, I'd be locked out of my own home with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. They were angels for exactly 1 week. Perfect, attentive, caring angels. And I fell for it completely. The day after the funeral, Daniel came over with groceries. He said he didn't want me to worry about anything. He unpacked everything, made me tea, sat with me while I cried. He asked if I needed help with paperwork. He asked if I understood Richard's finances. I admitted I didn't know much. Richard had always handled everything. Daniel nodded sympathetically. He said not to worry. He said he'd help me figure it all out. He said that's what family does. Stephanie came by every single day. She brought meals. She helped me sort through Richard's clothes, a task I'd been dreading. She held me when I broke down holding his favorite sweater. She told me stories about her dad, about her childhood, about how happy he'd been with me. She said I'd given him something her mother never could in those final years, real joy. I actually thanked her for saying that. I actually felt grateful. They invited me to dinner at Daniel's house on day 4. His wife made pot roast. We sat around their dining table and they toasted Richard's memory. They included me in every conversation. They asked about my life, my interests, my plans. Stephanie held my hand across the table and said I'd always have them. Always. Daniel agreed. He said his dad would have wanted them to take care of me. He said they would. On day 5, Daniel brought over some papers. He said they were just formalities. Estate stuff? Probate things. He used words I didn't fully understand. Fiduciary. Executor. Beneficiary designations. My head was still foggy with grief. I was taking sleeping pills just to get through the nights. I wasn't thinking clearly. He pointed to places I needed to sign. He said it was standard procedure. He said it would make everything easier. He smiled. The whole time. That same kind smile his father had. I signed everything he put in front of me. Stephanie took me to get my hair done on day 6. She said I needed to take care of myself. That Richard would want me to keep living. We got manicures. We had lunch at a nice restaurant. She paid for everything. She talked about maybe taking a trip together in a few months, just us girls, too. Help me heal. I told her I didn't have money for trips. She waved her hand dismissively. She said we'd figure it out. She said family helps family. Day 7 was a Sunday. Daniel and Stephanie both came over together. They helped me organize Richard's office. They sorted through files and documents. They said they were taking care of the legal stuff so I wouldn't have to deal with it. They asked if I had copies of any paperwork Richard might have given me. I said no. Everything was in his office. They nodded. They said that was fine. They said they had what they needed. Before they left, Stephanie hugged me tight. She said she loved me. She said I was brave. She said tomorrow would be better. Daniel hugged me too. He said to call if I needed anything at all. Anything. They walked out together, talking quietly to each other in a way I couldn't quite hear. That night I slept better than I had since Richard died. I felt supported. I felt like maybe I really did have a family. I felt like maybe I was going to be okay. When I woke up the next morning, my entire world had collapsed. ***, I woke up at 7:30 a.m. on day 8. Monday morning. The house was quiet. Too quiet. That heavy silence that still felt wrong without Richard's presence. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe. I was looking at a photo of Richard and me from our wedding, trying not to cry when I heard the front door open. I assumed it was Stephanie. She'd been coming by early most mornings. But when I walked into the living room, it was Daniel, and he wasn't alone. There was a man with him. Older, wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase. He looked official. My stomach tightened. Daniel's face wasn't kind anymore. It was blank. Professional. Cold. He said good morning like we were strangers. He introduced the man as his attorney. My confusion must have shown because Daniel continued quickly. He said they needed to discuss the property. He said there had been a misunderstanding about the estate. He said this house belonged to his father's trust and the trust beneficiaries were himself and Stephanie. I asked what he meant. I said this was my home. Richard and I lived here together. He was my husband. Daniel's attorney spoke then. His voice was calm and detached. He said that according to the deed and trust documents, the property was held in Richard's name alone. He said I had no legal ownership. He said that as of this morning, I was residing in a property owned by the estate. He used the word trespassing. That's when my hands started shaking. I told them there must be a mistake. I told them Richard would never leave me homeless. Daniel shook his head slowly. He said his father had made his wishes clear. He said the house and the primary assets went to his children. He said there might be some small provision for me, they'd have to check. But in the meantime I needed to vacate the property. Today. I asked where I was supposed to go. Stephanie appeared then. She'd been standing in the hallway the whole time. Her face was different too. Harder. She said I could stay with friends. She said I could figure it out. She said this was their father's house and they needed to secure it. The word secure hit me like a slap. I asked for time. Just a few days to make arrangements. To understand what was happening. To find a place to go. Daniel said no. His attorney said they'd be changing the locks at noon and I needed to remove my personal belongings immediately. He handed me a document. Legal language I couldn't process through my panic. Something about estate rights and property claims. He said I could contest it if I wanted, but that would take months and cost money I probably didn't have. They watched me pack. That's the part I'll never forget. They stood there in the home I'd shared with Richard and watched me stuff my clothes into garbage bags because I couldn't find suitcases fast enough. I grabbed photos. I grabbed my toiletries. I grabbed the sweater of Richard's I'd been sleeping in. I was crying, begging them to explain, asking what I'd done wrong. Neither of them answered. They just watched. By 11:45 a.m., I was standing on the front lawn with 4 garbage bags and a box of personal items. At exactly noon, a locksmith arrived. He changed every lock while I stood there. Daniel handed me a paper with a phone number. He said if I had questions about the estate, I could call their attorney. Then they went inside my home and closed the door. I heard the deadbolt slide into place, and I had absolutely nowhere to go. I sat in my car in the driveway for 2 hours. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I kept staring at the house, expecting someone to open the door and tell me this was a terrible joke. That it was a misunderstanding. That Richard's children hadn't just thrown a 61-year-old widow onto the street. But nobody came out. The curtains were drawn. I could see movement inside through one window. They were in there. In my home. Going through my things probably. Dividing up Richard's life. Erasing me. Around 2 p.m., a neighbor walked by with her dog, Mrs. Patterson. An older woman Richard and I used to chat with on evening walks. She saw me in the car surrounded by garbage bags and her face filled with concern. She came over. She asked if I was okay. I tried to explain, but the words came out broken. She looked horrified. She offered to let me stay with her. But then she hesitated. She said her son was visiting with his family and they didn't have room. She said maybe just for one night. I could see the discomfort in her eyes. The uncertainty. The fear of getting involved in family drama. I told her I'd be fine. I lied. I thanked her and started the car. I drove away because I couldn't bear to sit there anymore. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove. I ended up at a grocery store parking lot. I sat there until the sun went down. I had $17 in my purse. That's all. I didn't have access to bank accounts. Everything had been in Richard's name. Our credit cards were his. I'd never thought to have my own. Why would I? We were married. We were partners. What a stupid, naive fool I'd been. I bought a bottle of water and a sandwich with some of my cash. I ate it in the car as the parking lot emptied. Security drove by twice, slowing down to look at me. I pretended to be on my phone. By 10 p.m., I was one of only 3 cars left. It was getting cold. I had a blanket in the trunk, the one we'd used for picnics. It still smelled like Richard, like his cologne and fresh air and better days. I climbed into the back seat and wrapped myself in that blanket. The car was cramped. My back ached. Every time someone walked by, I tensed up, afraid they'd knock on the window or call the police. I thought about my life. About how I'd gone from a home and a husband and a future to homeless in 8 days. 8 days. That's all it took for Richard's children to destroy me. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the last week. The kindness. The dinners. The help with paperwork. Oh God, the paperwork. What had I signed? What had Daniel made me sign when I was too grief-stricken to think straight? Had I signed away my own rights? Had I helped them steal my own life? Around 3 a.m., I started crying so hard I thought I'd be sick. I had no money, no home, no family, no options. I was too old to start over. Too broke to fight. Too alone to hope. I thought about Richard. About how he'd promised to take care of me. About how he'd failed. Or had he? Had he known his children would do this? Had he tried to protect me and they'd found a way around it? That's when the memory hit me. Richard's friend. The accountant. What was his name? His name came to me at 4:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my phone. Desperate for any distraction from the cold and fear. Thomas Brennan. Richard had introduced us at a dinner party about 2 years ago. Some retirement celebration. For a mutual colleague. I remembered him because he'd been kind. He'd asked me questions about myself, really listened. Not like most of Richard's friends who saw me as the new wife and not much else. I remembered Richard mentioning him a few times after that, always in passing. Something about Thomas handling. Some accounting work. Something about trusts and estate planning. Richard had gone to meet with him maybe 6 months before he died. I'd asked about it, and Richard had been vague. He'd said just boring financial stuff. He'd kissed my forehead and changed the subject. But now that memory felt significant. Why would Richard meet with his accountant 6 months before a sudden heart attack? You don't plan for sudden. Unless it wasn't about the heart attack. Unless it was about something else. Unless Richard had been trying to protect me and I'd been too trusting to notice. I waited until 8 a.m., reasonable business hours. I was still in the parking lot, stiff and exhausted, but I had a thread of hope now. Something to pull. I searched for Thomas Brennan on my phone. There were several, but only one was a CPA in our area. Brennan Financial Services. I called the number with shaking hands. A receptionist answered. Professional. Cheerful. I asked. For Thomas Brennan. She asked if I had an appointment. I said no, but that it was about Richard Morrison's estate. There was a pause. Then she said please hold. The hold music was classical piano. It made me want to cry because Richard loved classical piano. Thomas picked up within a minute. His voice was careful. He said my name like a question. Margaret? I said yes. I said I didn't know if he remembered me. He cut me off gently. He said, of course he remembered me. He asked how I was holding up. His tone was genuinely concerned. I started crying. I couldn't help it. I tried to explain what happened, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He stopped me. He said not over the phone. He asked where I was. I told him, embarrassed, that I was in a grocery store parking lot. That I'd slept in my car. That I had nowhere else to go. There was a long silence. Then he said to come to his office immediately. He gave me the address. He said he'd been hoping I'd contact him. That Richard had made him promise something. That we needed to talk right away. I drove there on fumes. Literally. My gas light had been on since the night before. I had maybe $10 left and I'd need that for food. But I made it to his office, a small professional building on the edge of downtown. I walked in looking like exactly what I was, a homeless woman who'd slept in her car, carrying her life in garbage bags. The receptionist didn't judge me. She smiled kindly and led me straight to Thomas's office. He was older than I remembered, maybe mid-60s, with gray hair and glasses and a face that looked genuinely worried when he saw me. He stood up. He closed the door behind me. He told me to sit down. And then he said the words that changed everything. Margaret, Richard set up a trust. And you're the primary beneficiary. I think you need to see this. Asterisk. Thomas placed a folder in front of me. It was thick, official looking, with Richard's name printed on the tab. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely open it. Thomas sat back in his chair and watched me with careful eyes. He said Richard had come to him 9 months before he died. He said Richard had been worried. Not about his health, he'd seemed fine physically, but about his children. About their attitudes. About how they treated me. I looked up sharply. Thomas nodded. He said Richard wasn't blind. He'd noticed the tension. The way Daniel asked about money constantly. The way Stephanie made comments about the house and assets. Richard had wanted to make sure I was protected. So he'd created a separate trust. One his children didn't know about. I stared at the papers, but the legal language was swimming. I asked Thomas to just tell me what it meant. He leaned forward. He explained it carefully. Richard had moved significant assets into an irrevocable trust 6 months before his death. Not everything, Thomas clarified, but enough. Much more than his children realized. The house they'd just stolen was actually the least valuable asset in Richard's estate. The real money was in investments, retirement accounts, life insurance policies, and property I'd never even heard of. And all of it had been transferred into this trust, with me as the primary beneficiary. I couldn't breathe. I asked why. Why? Would Richard do this? Thomas's expression softened. He said Richard loved me, truly loved me. And he didn't trust his children to do right by me after he was gone. He'd seen their greed. He'd made Thomas promise to contact me after his death and explain everything. But Thomas had been out of the country for 2 weeks on a family emergency. He'd only gotten back yesterday. He'd tried to call me, but the number he had was disconnected. I realized numbly that it had been the house phone. Daniel must have canceled it. I asked how much. Thomas slid a paper toward me. A summary sheet. The number at the bottom made my vision blur. $1.7 million. $1.7 million in assets. Plus the life insurance policy payout, which was another $500,000. Richard had been far wealthier than I'd ever known. He'd lived modestly, below his means, and he'd protected his wealth carefully. I started sobbing. Thomas handed me tissues. He waited. When I could speak again, I asked what happened to the house. Thomas's face hardened. He said the house had been part of Richard's original estate, the one his children inherited as per the old will. Richard had left it that way intentionally. He'd told Thomas it was a test. If his children treated me well, supported me, honored their father's memory, then they'd keep the house, and everyone would be fine. But if they betrayed me, well, Thomas said. Richard had left instructions for that too. I asked what kind of instructions. Thomas smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who was about to deliver justice. He said Richard had included a provision. If his children attempted to remove me from the property without cause, or if they failed to honor certain support requirements outlined in the will, then they would forfeit their inheritance. All of it, not just the house. Everything in the original estate, and it would revert to the trust. To me, I asked if they knew about this provision. Thomas shook his head. He said they had no idea. And he suggested we keep it that way for now. Because there was something else I needed to know. Asterisk. Thomas pulled out another document. This one had my name on it. Margaret Morrison, beneficiary rights and distributions. He explained that the trust wasn't just money sitting in an account. It was structured. Smart. Richard had worked with Thomas for months to set it up properly. There were investment accounts generating income. There were rental properties I'd never heard of, 3 of them in neighboring counties, all producing monthly income. There was a life insurance policy with me as the direct beneficiary, not the estate. And there were specific instructions for how everything should be handled. Richard had left me a letter too. Thomas handed it to me. The envelope was in Richard's handwriting. My name across the front. To be opened only in the presence of Thomas Brennan. My hands shook as I opened it. Richard's words, his voice, coming back from beyond the grave. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And I can only hope that my children have proven me wrong. But if they've hurt you, if they've tried to take what you deserve, then I need you to know that I prepared for this. You were the light of my final years. You gave me joy I thought I'd never feel again. And I will not let anyone, not even my own children, destroy you after I'm gone. The trust Thomas is showing you contains everything I could protect. It's yours. All of it. Use it to build the life you deserve. Use it to be free. And if Daniel and Stephanie have shown their true colors, know that I saw it coming. I saw their greed. I hoped I was wrong, but I planned in case I wasn't. Thomas will help you. Trust him. And Margaret, don't let guilt stop you from taking what's yours. You earned it by loving me when I needed love. You earned it by being genuine in a family that had forgotten how. Take it. Live well. And know that, wherever I am, I'm still loving you. Forever yours, Richard. I couldn't see the paper anymore through my tears. Thomas gave me time. He got me water. He waited until I could speak again. When I finally looked up, I asked what happened now. What was I supposed to do with this information? Thomas said first, we secure the assets. Make sure Daniel and Stephanie can't touch anything in the trust. That was already done. It was protected, but we needed to formalize my access. Set up accounts in my name. Transfer funds. Get me stable. He said I could have access to money by the end of the day. Enough to get a hotel. Buy food. Breathe. Second, he said, we addressed the house situation. The provision Richard had written was clear. By locking me out without notice, without support, without honoring their father's wishes, Daniel and Stephanie had violated the terms of the inheritance. Thomas could file a legal challenge. He could invoke the forfeiture clause. But he wanted to know what I wanted. Did I want to fight? Did I want revenge? Did I want to just take my trust money and walk away? I thought about Richard's letter, about sleeping in my car, about the way they'd watched me pack my life into garbage bags, about the cruelty in their eyes. I thought about the week of fake kindness, the manipulation, the papers they'd made me sign. I looked at Thomas and asked him what Richard would want me to do. Thomas didn't hesitate. He said Richard would want me to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate a grieving woman. He said Richard would want justice. So would I ***. Thomas filed the legal notice 3 days later. By then I was set up in a decent hotel with access to funds from the trust. I'd bought real clothes. I'd eaten real meals. I'd slept in a bed. I felt human again. But more than that, I felt powerful. Because I knew something Daniel and Stephanie didn't. And their world was about to implode. The notice was delivered to both of them simultaneously. Thursday morning, 9 a.m., Thomas had hired process servers to hand-deliver it. One to Daniel at his real estate office. One to Stephanie at her home. The document was formal and devastating. It informed them that their removal of me from the property had triggered a forfeiture clause in their father's will. It informed them that their inheritance was now in dispute. It informed them that all estate assets were being frozen pending legal review. And it requested their appearance at an estate hearing in 2 weeks. Thomas called me at 11:30 a.m. He was laughing. He said Daniel had called his office 17 times in 2 hours. Stephanie had shown up in person, hysterical, demanding to speak to him. Both of them were panicking. Because for the first time, they realized they might have made a mistake. A catastrophic mistake. I asked what they were saying. Thomas said they were denying everything. Claiming I'd left voluntarily. Claiming they'd offered to let me stay and I'd refused. Complete lies. But Thomas had documentation. He had the locksmith's records showing they'd changed the locks. He had my testimony. He had their own attorney's letter telling me to vacate. They'd been so confident, so arrogant, that they'd created a paper trail of their own cruelty. Daniel called me directly that afternoon. I almost didn't answer. His name on my phone made my stomach turn. But Thomas had told me to document everything, so I answered on speaker and started recording. Daniel's voice was strained. Fake friendly. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said maybe they'd been hasty. He said grief makes people do things they don't mean. I stayed silent. He kept talking, filling the silence with excuses. He said they could work this out. Family should stick together. Maybe I could move back into the house. Maybe they could arrange a monthly allowance. Maybe we could forget this whole legal thing happened. I asked him one question. Why did you throw me out? There was a long pause. Then he said it was complicated. Estate issues, legal stuff, nothing personal. I asked again. Why did you make me sleep in my car? His voice changed then. Got defensive. He said I was being dramatic. That I could have stayed with friends. That I could have asked them for help. I reminded him that I had asked. I'd begged. He'd said no. Another pause. Then he said we should really talk in person. Work this out like adults. Like family. I told him we'd talk at the hearing. Then I hung up. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From rage. From satisfaction. Because now they were scared. Now they understood that I wasn't helpless. That their father had outmaneuvered them from beyond the grave. Stephanie tried next. She sent texts. Dozens of them. Apologizing. Saying she'd Been wrong. Saying she missed me. Saying her dad would want us to reconcile. She called it reconciliation like we'd had a simple argument. Like she hadn't locked me out of my home and left me homeless. I didn't respond. Thomas advised me not to engage directly. Let them panic. Let them wonder. Let them fear what was coming, because what was coming was justice. And it was going to be legal, final, and absolutely brilliant. Would you forgive them? If you were in my position? Or would you do what I was about to do? The legal notice was just the beginning. Thomas and I spent the next week building an airtight case. We documented everything. The timeline of Richard's death. The 7 days of false kindness. The lockout. My night in the car. The grocery store parking lot. The papers Daniel had made me sign while I was grieving. Thomas had a forensic accountant review those documents. Turns out I'd signed nothing legally binding. Daniel had tried to trick me into signing away rights I didn't even have to sign away. The trust was completely separate, protected, untouchable. But that wasn't all. Thomas dug deeper into the estate. He found discrepancies. Money missing from Richard's personal accounts in the weeks before his death. Small transfers. A few thousand here. A few thousand there. All going to Daniel's business account. Richard had been helping his son financially and Daniel had never disclosed it. That mattered because estate law requires full transparency. Daniel had a financial interest he hadn't reported. It compromised his position as executor. Stephanie had issues too. She'd moved things out of the house. Valuable things. Richard's watch collection, his rare books, art pieces. All within days of his death. Before probate had even started. Before any inventory had been filed. That's called estate theft. It's illegal. And Thomas had proof because a neighbor had seen the moving truck. Mrs. Patterson, the woman with the dog who'd tried to help me. She'd mentioned it to Thomas when he'd interviewed witnesses. She had photos. She'd thought it was strange how quickly they were emptying the house. The legal notice Thomas filed wasn't just about the forfeiture clause. It was a comprehensive challenge to their handling of the entire estate. It accused Daniel of conflicts of interest. It accused Stephanie of theft. It demanded a full accounting of all assets. It requested removal of Daniel as executor. And it demanded that the estate be frozen until an independent third party could review everything. Judge granted the freeze within 48 hours. Emergency order. Everything stopped. Daniel couldn't sell the house. Stephanie couldn't access estate funds. The bank accounts were locked. The properties were frozen. Suddenly they had nothing. Just like they'd left me with nothing. The irony was beautiful. They hired their own attorney, expensive one. Big firm downtown. That attorney called Thomas to negotiate. Thomas said no. Not yet. The hearing would proceed. Let them sweat. Let them understand what it feels like to be powerless. I asked Thomas if I was being vindictive. He said no. He said I was being smart. He said people like Daniel and Stephanie never learn unless consequences are severe. Richard had known that. That's why he'd set things up this way. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning, 2 weeks after the initial notice. Thomas prepared me for what to expect. Their attorney would attack my credibility. They'd claim I was a gold digger. That I'd manipulated Richard. That our marriage was a scam. Thomas said to expect cruelty, to expect lies. But he also said we had the truth. We had documents. We had Richard's own words in that letter. And we had the law on our side. The night before the hearing, I read Richard's letter again. I thought about the man who'd loved me enough to protect me even after death. Who'd seen his children's greed and chosen me anyway. I wasn't angry anymore. I was determined. This wasn't about revenge. It was about honoring Richard's wishes. It was about justice. It was about showing two spoiled adults that actions have consequences. I went to bed early. I slept well. And when I woke up Monday morning, I was ready to face them. Ready to speak my truth. Ready to win. The courthouse was cold and formal. Gray walls. Fluorescent lights. The kind of place where emotions get measured and weighed and turned into legal arguments. Thomas met me outside the courtroom. He was carrying 2 briefcases full of documents. He looked confident. He told me to stay calm. Answer questions directly. Tell the truth. That's all I needed to do. Daniel and Stephanie were already inside with their attorney. A woman in expensive suit with a severe haircut and sharp eyes. She looked at me like I was an insect. Daniel wouldn't make eye contact. Stephanie did. She looked desperate. Her eyes were red. She'd been crying. Part of me, a small part, felt sorry for her. Then I remembered sleeping in my car and the pity vanished. The judge was a woman in her 50s. Judge Catherine Walsh. She reviewed the filings in silence while we all sat there. The tension was suffocating. Finally, she looked up. She asked Daniel's attorney to present their position first. The attorney stood. She argued that I was contesting a valid estate distribution, that Richards will clearly left the house and primary assets to his children, that I'd been provided for through other means, that my claims of mistreatment were exaggerated, that I'd left the property voluntarily after being given reasonable notice. Thomas stood when it was his turn. He was calm, almost friendly. He started by presenting the trust documents. He explained how Richard had specifically moved assets to protect me. He showed the judge Richard's letter. He read portions aloud. The courtroom was silent. Even there, attorney looked uncomfortable. Then Thomas presented the evidence of my lockout. The locksmith records, the neighbor testimony, the recording of Daniel's phone call where he admitted they'd changed the locks, the text from Stephanie that contradicted their claim I'd left voluntarily. Then came the bombshell. Thomas presented evidence of Daniel's undisclosed financial interest, the transfers from Richard's accounts. He presented photos of Stephanie removing property before probate. He argued that both of them had violated their fiduciary duties, that they'd acted in bad faith, that they'd triggered the forfeiture clause through their own actions. And he requested that the court uphold Richard's trust provisions and remove Daniel as executor. Judge Walsh asked Daniel directly about the money transfers. He stammered, said his father had offered to help with business expenses. The judge asked why he hadn't disclosed this to the court. Daniel had no good answer. She asked Stephanie about the removed property. Stephanie claimed she'd taken personal items, family heirlooms. The judge asked if she'd filed an inventory. Stephanie admitted she hadn't. The judge's expression hardened. We broke for lunch. In the hallway, Stephanie approached me. She was crying. She said, "Please. Just please." She said they'd made mistakes. She said they were sorry. She said, "Couldn't we work something out?" Her voice was desperate, broken. I looked at her and felt nothing. No anger, no pity, nothing. I said we'd see what the judge decided. She grabbed my arm. She said she'd lose everything. Her house was mortgaged against her expected inheritance. Daniel had debts. They'd been counting on this money. They needed it. I pulled my arm away. I said I'd needed a home. I'd needed compassion. I'd needed family. And they'd given me garbage bags and a locked door. Stephanie's face crumpled. She walked away. Daniel stood at the end of the hallway watching. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. Good. The judge called us back at 2 p.m. She'd made her decision. And it was about to change everything. Judge Walsh upheld every provision of Richard's trust. She ruled that Daniel and Stephanie had violated the forfeiture clause through their treatment of me. She removed Daniel as executor and appointed an independent administrator. She ordered Stephanie to return all property removed from the house. And she validated my position as primary beneficiary of the protected trust assets. But here's what I did that shocked everyone. I didn't take their house. I didn't pursue additional damages. I took exactly what Richard had left me. The $1.7 million in trust assets, the life insurance, the rental properties. Everything that was legally and morally mine. And I walked away from the rest. I told Thomas not to fight them for anything else. They could keep their father's house. They could have what was left of the original estate. I didn't want their guilt money. I wanted my freedom. I donated $200,000 to a women's shelter, in Richard's name, for women escaping bad situations. Women who need second chances. Then I bought myself a small house, nothing extravagant. Just mine, truly mine. I started volunteering at the library again. I took art classes. I lived the life Richard wanted me to have. Daniel and Stephanie sent a card months later, apologizing. I never responded. Some betrayals don't deserve forgiveness. Some lessons need to stick. Richard knew that. That's why he protected me. That's why his love reached beyond the grave and saved me when I had nothing. So if you're facing betrayal, if someone's counting you out, if they think you're powerless, remember this. Document everything, know your worth, and never underestimate the power of someone who has nothing left to lose. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment telling me what you would have done. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, legal, and absolutely brilliant.